For those of you that don't know me, I know many faces in the room. I'm Adam Scott. I'm delighted to be here today to chat to you a bit about the London Plan. And I guess, why am I here talking about something that's got the word London in it? Well, I guess as it was alluded to earlier in the presentation of Phil's, maybe in America, some things that happen in America seem to find their way across the pond to us in the UK eventually. And I would suggest, particularly in the context of what we're going to chat about here, what's going on down in London at the moment, I think is just going to come out all over the place, particularly with respect to what Dave alluded to earlier, these HRBs, these higher risk buildings of more than 18 metres. There's a lot of discussion going on in London around this. So the three things I'm going to chat about. What is the London Plan? And why is it relevant outside London? Why in its current form is the London Plan a challenge for the lift industry? And what can we, maybe as an industry, do to address this challenge? So in terms of the first one, what is the London Plan and why might it be relevant outside London? Well, the London Plan, this is the document, or the front page of it. It was published in March 2021. And I guess it was about a year and a bit ago, I'd never heard of the London Plan. And then we started to have some discussions in London on design projects where architects were saying, oh, I want 4 evacuation lifts. And we went, we haven't really done 4 evacuation lifts in the last 10 years. Why do we suddenly need 4 in this building? And they were saying, because it's the London Plan. And that was where the discussion started to go in London. And everyone was saying, we've got this new document in London and we've got to comply with it. When you actually open the London Plan and look at what it says and what it's trying to do, the Mayor has a legal responsibility to put in place what's called this spatial development strategy, this SDS. And the London Plan is the SDS for London. And it's just trying to set out an integrated development framework for London over the next 20 to 25 years. It's a sizable document then, and it's touching on many, many different aspects of development beyond buildings, touching on things like infrastructure, as well as the building piece that we're all interested in. In London, it is a legal document. It applies in Greater London, but we're already sensing it being quoted in broader and broader environments and scenarios, hence my expectation that it will simply come out around the UK and indeed maybe seem to be adopted as best practice, maybe outside of the UK. And we've certainly seen in the past that British standards and the way that British standards historically have been ahead of the game in terms of firefighters lift design and possibly also evacuation lift design. Maybe this is a document that will form the blueprint for standards and an approach in the Far East and the Middle East and other countries. The London Plan says that its requirements must be taken into account as part of the planning design process, and that planning decisions should, not shall, should require compliance. It's not intended to be a design or a safety standard as such, and it shouldn't be referenced by the fire service or building control. In my experience, what's happening in London is not that. Everyone's quoting it as a standard, you've got to comply, you won't get planning without it. And therein lies some of the challenge. Because it's been quoted, we've got variance in understanding of what is it actually asking us for. Its current form is the form that's causing some challenge and some debate for the lift industry. And in the forward, we've got a nice picture there of Sadiq, looking professional and mayoral. And in the kind of forward, it talks about this fantastic piece of consultation that they went through with tons and tons of different stakeholders, asking opinion on how to form and develop this London Plan document. And I think from the lift industry, we all kind of went, consultation? Well, we haven't heard of this thing, but where's this come from? And it comes back to this point we've touched on in a number of presentations today, that it is hard as an industry to find the time to comment on draft standards and draft guidance and draft legislation. But if we don't find the time, it only causes problems. And then we have to find the time, because we spend more time debating the problems caused by us not finding the time to refine the guidance before it was published. If we start to dig into a little bit more of the detail, and then you'll start to understand why it's causing some challenges. I think that in the discussions that we've had, and Nick and myself have been working with the GLA on this and trying to refine the guidance, we're all fully supportive of what it's striving to do. It is striving to achieve the highest standards of accessible and inclusive design. And it's trying to incorporate safe and dignified emergency evacuation for all building users. The word dignified there is really important. The third quote here that's coming out of this overarching guidance is where we start to have some problems. So it says, where lifts are installed, as a minimum at least one lift per core or more, subject to capacity assessments, which is the idea that Gina was talking about just now, should be a suitably sized fire evacuation lift. That sounds okay. What's a core? This is a floor plan of a job we're working in London. Okay, it's a big job, but it's big because it illustrates a point. The green boxes there are stairs. The stairs are cores. We often hear architects talking about stair cores, so I've got 4 of them. And the orange ones are goods lifts, so goods lift core, I've got 3 of them. Yeah, and then I've got other passenger lift cores, I've got 9 of them. So I need 13 evacuation lifts? Yeah. So what's a core? Yeah. The other thing it asked me for was a fire evacuation lift. Well, in the lift world, what's that? Is that a firefighting lift? Is that a firefighter's lift? Very different things. Or is that an emergency evacuation lift? We're not sure. And I think as the industry, we've been engaging with the GLA to say we're fully supportive of this. We think it's a fantastic direction of travel for design, but we don't quite understand what we want yet. Yeah? And some of that misunderstanding is coming out of the use of language that isn't, in our opinion, precise enough. How do we design and commission a fire evacuation? Some of the documents that Nick was referring to earlier. We've got on the left part 72, the firefighter's design standard. We know what that is. If somebody says to us, I need a firefighter's lift, as the lift industry, we know how to design that, we know how to install it, we know how to test it, we know how to commission it. Likewise, an evac lift. We understand evacuation lift, as Nick was saying. We've got that. BS 49's Annex G tells us what an evacuation lift needs to be able to do. And then we also have, within the Code of Practice 391 for residential, we have some commentary on evacuation lists in there as well. So again, this idea that if the London plan was a bit more precise, then we as an industry could respond and understand what it is you're asking us to do. So we read through this London plan and we say, okay, we understand you want something and you're calling it a fire evacuation lift, but can you tell us any more about it? So this bottom piece that's highlighted here, it talks about a fire evacuation lift shall be suitable for the purposes intended, and it points us at another document, so yet more documents. This document is called Policy D12, and it's about the fire safety piece. So the whole evacuation lift piece, whilst it says safe and dignified access and egress for all, it is really looked at in the context of fire safety, and to the comments that made earlier in today's discussions. Post-Grenfell, really, I think it's focused everybody's mind on this area, and this is what's driven this element of the London plan. So we have this nice document on the left, fire safety. This was published February 2022. So we went through a step where they came out with some pre-consultation stuff that was problematic in some of its language. A lot of work that Nick and Lear and BSI lobbied has improved that, and this latest document, which is still guidance, that came out in Feb 2022, has gone a long way to help with that. It's still out for consultation. And to this earlier point about us trying to engage to help refine guidance and avoid problems, 20th of June, this consultation finishes. So there is still a window of opportunity to influence what's being said in this document. Who is the guidance for? So within this fire safety guidance, there's another policy that is the one that's the focus for us in the lift industry, policy D5. And this is the one that tells us what the London plan thinks an evacuation lift is. And I think there's a really important principle here that again touches on this idea of competence that we've been talking about, and Phil and his chartered engineering credentials, and Gina mentioned it in her presentation in terms of the London plan requiring fire safety assessments to be done by professional, qualified, and demonstrably qualified fire engineers. I think it's really important that we in the lift industry understand what we are competent and expert in, and as importantly, what we're not. And we don't stray into areas that we're not, particularly when they're related to fire. I think that's a very, very important point that we need to recognise. And I think there's a danger in this stuff that we start to stray into areas that aren't our responsibility or our expertise. This point talks about, the highlighted point, applicants need to understand that they need to use fire safety professionals and designers to determine when an evacuation lift is to be provided and to ensure fire safety has been appropriately considered. So as a lift industry, certainly as a lift consultant, I would sit there and say, you know, I don't know whether you need an evacuation lift. I don't know how many you need. Yeah, I know what it is. Yeah, if you ask me for two and you say put one there and put one there, I can do that. Yeah, but I don't know how big they need to be or where they need to go. That's your responsibility as the fire engineer. The London Plan guidance then starts to give us a bit more detail about what it thinks, and a lot of this starts to align with some of the stuff that Nick was talking about earlier, and that's because Nick's been lobbying the GLA to improve the pre-consultation draft guidance, and we're getting closer and closer. So it talks evacuation lift is a passenger or goods lift that's been specifically designed to be used as a means of escape for people that require level access and assistance during an emergency, and that they have additional structural, electrical and fire protection features, so that they can operate as an evacuation lift. So I think we recognise that in the industry as, yeah, that's the principles that in the old Part 8 and that have been taken through into 4.9's Annex G. When should an evacuation lift be provided? It says at least one lift per core, so again we've still got this reference to core that's problematic. And here it also says in this second sentence, the planning requirement for evacuation lifts is in addition to the requirements for firefighters lifts. Now to me that's not clear enough what that means, but the interpretation we're getting in London at the moment is you can't use a firefighter's lift as an evac lift. Now technically we might jump at that and say, well actually the firefighter's lift has got a lot of the things that not all, but a lot of the things an evac lift needs anyway, not least of which it runs in a protected core. But now you're saying I can't use that. And again, we found ourselves getting engaged in those discussions about why, and then actually kind of winding back and saying, I don't care why. You know, that's not my field of expertise. Yeah? You tell me what you need, and I'll provide it. Yeah? And if you can't use a firefighter's lift as an evac lift, you know, I'm interested, but I'm not going to challenge it. It also talks here about, in this second point, about Appendix 4, which we'll look at in a minute, which gives us some more information as well. The London Plan guidance, it talks about the need to demonstrate the suitable provision of evacuation lifts has been incorporated into the development, and that the fire statement, or the PFSS, should include a capacity assessment, evacuation strategy, lift management plan, and a declaration of compliance. So again, that's talking about the fire statement, which it says has to be done by a professional, competent person, and within the fire statement needs to be a capacity assessment. I think it's the capacity assessment piece where we start to stray into the lift industry, where if I was a fire engineer, and I've chatted to some of our fire engineers, they say, you know, I can tell you what the requirement might be in terms of I want to get everyone out of the building in X time, but I can't really simulate how the lifts might be able to do that or not. And I think that's the piece that we can help with. So this last part, this declaration of compliance, which is unfortunate wording again, because to my note at the bottom there, this is not the declaration of conformity. This is a totally different thing. And it's something that we don't need to get involved with. The declaration of compliance is not issued by the lift industry. It's a fire safety professional document. And I think there's some danger of confusion there if we're not careful. So that again it's going to be like I guess our declaration of conformity is a legal document. This will be a legal document for fire engineers to make a declaration that their design complies to the legal requirements. Appendix 4 starts to give us a bit more detail. Unfortunately, that first point, it still says one lift per core. It doesn't yet say what the core needs to be. And it starts to say a suitably sized evacuation lift. Well, what's that? Yeah. And you know, that starts to play into some of Gina's content and slides on what that might be. And I would suggest even what that demand and the mix is. As a lift industry, I might be saying, I don't know. You're the access consultant, you're the fire consultant, you tell me what I need to model and I'll tell you how many lifts and how big and what speed they need to run at. A412, I mean at the moment it says there are currently no published standards for evacuation lifts. Well, I think we've seen this afternoon that there are. And well, we know, BS49s exists. So there's, again, some problematic wording in there. There's a table in here that compares evac lifts against firefighters' lifts. And the very fact that this part of the standard talks about firefighters' lifts, again, is down to the lobbying and the work that Nick has done with the GLA. So we seem now to have got rid of this problematic term fire evacuation lift, and we're now talking in language that the lift industry understands better. A firefighter's lift, I know what that is, that's a Part 72 lift. Evac lift, I know what that is, it's a 49s lift at the moment. But then you look at that highlighted word there, firefighters' lifts, well, 49s doesn't like that. You have a firefighter's lift that's actually formally recognised as a goods lift. So again, that's potentially problematic. If you get, you can imagine that discussion with an architect. They're saying, well, we're going to use the goods lift as the evac lift, and where we go, oh, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, because BS49 is a code of practice says you shouldn't do it. Yeah? It then talks about some other key features of the building design that we recognise: a fire-protected lift shaft, safe lobbies in front of all the lift entrances, smoke control measures, secondary power, all the things that we recognise as part of an evac lift. Again, the yellow highlighted piece at the bottom I think is really important, this provision of a management plan. But again, from a lift industry perspective, I would be saying that's outside of my expertise. That's, you tell me what particular control functions you might want on this lift. We can come back to you and respond whether we can do that, and ultimately we can, what the price is, etc., etc. But telling you, inputting into that is outside of our expertise, I would suggest. It then starts to talk a little bit about the lift requirements themselves, and again, nothing that's particularly controversial or unusual. There's a piece here about size, and again, it talks on the firefighters column with some problematic words there, minimum lift car size specified, and then it talks about two options. It doesn't talk about kilogram rating, it talks about numbers of people. It potentially conflicts with the minimum defined in Part 72, and it's all these little details, and you might say, well, they're not important, but they provoke debate and discussion, and that costs time, and time is money. And why wouldn't you, on a piece of guidance as important and significant as this, go through the final steps and refine the language as best you can to remove that opportunity for debate and discussion. There's an interesting piece here on the evac lift side of this, where no specified lift size. Yeah? And we've had a discussion with them saying, well, wouldn't it be great if we could actually have a minimum lift size that we think is the appropriate size? And back to that piece about the capacity assessment, I think that would be really interesting. Maybe there's some kind of parametric equation you could do, Gene, and that to find the optimum shape of a lift car so your jigsaw algorithm works in the most effective way. One for Richard, maybe. But it is interesting that I think there's stuff in the HTM, the Health Technical Memorandum Guidance, that talks about recommended sizes for evacuating hospitals and things like that. We've got that. It's never been clear to me, clause in Part 72, the firefighters lift standard, that says where expected or anticipated for use of evacuation, it should be a 1,000 kilogram deep car, 1100 by 21. But how does that play? Should that be what's in here, 11 by 21? So again, we think it might be useful to have some information in there. This last line was also a very problematic line. It reads much better now, again, thanks to Mr. Mellor's lobbying, because when it was first published as pre-consultation guidance, it told you to go away and read 81 Part 76. So we had architects coming to us saying, we need a Part 76 lift. And we said, Part 76 doesn't exist. And they said, yes, it does. Here's a document, which is the PREM, the kind of pre-release document for public comment, that had then subsequently been withdrawn. So actually even that document didn't exist. So we had a London plan had a legal standing, and the guidance on how to comply to the London plan referenced a standard that didn't exist. So we were in quite a mess. We're getting there, and you can see now that those standards are as correct as, well, they are correct in accordance with what we've got at the moment. One other problem that I can see that we seem to be having discussions on at the moment on jobs in London is this piece about a protected lobby. So 49s, that extract from BS49s at the top there, clearly says an evac lift should be situated within a protected enclosure. consisting of the lift well itself and a protected lobby at each storey served by the lift, and should be provided with a protected route from the evac lift lobby at the final exit level to the final exit from the building. So we can see in a residential building, if you've got a residential building more than 18 metres high, you're going to need a firefighter's lift. And typically that firefighter's lift will be in a protected lobby. If the resi building needs a pair of lifts, or sometimes maybe 3 lifts as it gets higher and higher, then all of those lifts are typically in a protected lobby. So if I say, okay, the one on the left is a firefighter's lift and the one on the right is an evac lift, they're likely to both be in a protected lobby. So they're likely to comply with 4.9s just because of the main building design anyway. But if we take that approach to a commercial building, I can see this being a bit problematic, because typically the only lift that runs in a protected core in a commercial office building layout is the firefighter's lift. But then the London plan says we can't use that as evac lift, you've got to use something else. So if I then say, okay, I'm going to use one of my front of house passenger lifts, which seems to be the preference at the moment, then all of a sudden you've got a lobby at every single level and you've got a fire protected. And that's big cost. And then when it lands at the ground to your beautiful reception space, you've got to have a protected exit route that connects you and gets you out of the building. And also, Mr. Architect, by the way, you need these pretty ugly comms panels at every single level in your front of house lobby, particularly at your main FSAL, your main reception level. You've got this nice ugly panel. I guess we could use goods lifts, would be the other option. But again, they don't tend to run in a protected core typically, because we've always said, we shouldn't have goods lifts as firefighters lifts, therefore there's no need for them to be in a protected core. The other issue we've got with goods lifts is, and I didn't know this until I read 4.9s properly, well, not that I've read it properly, but you dip in and you read it, I didn't know it said that. There's a clause in there that says, an evac lift to BS 4.9 shall also comply to Part 70, the standard for accessibility. So now all of a sudden my goods lifts need handrails. Is that right for a goods lift? Seems a bit problematic. So there's so many knock-on issues here before you start to think about, well, what might the minimum size of that lift be? And you take that 13-person deep car, well, you might get that as a minimum in certain residential buildings, I guess, for the movement of furniture and stuff. But in maybe smaller developments, if all of a sudden you're saying the lift needs to be significantly bigger because it's an evac lift, and by the way, my capacity assessment says I need 2 of them, that's, oh, and by the way, my fire engineer says I need 2 stairs as well. Before long, the developer's saying, well, I can't afford to build this, and they walk away. So my thoughts on some of where we are and maybe where we need to get to. So I think, as we've said, or I touched on earlier, I think as an industry we need to be very careful with scope and viability. And I think, and I guess this has come home to roost dramatically in the fire engineering world at the moment, obviously because of the tragedy of Grenfell and other issues. But this piece about competency, I think, is only going to become more and more important, and the need for us all to recognise what we do know, and as importantly what we don't know. And even if we do know things outside of our core industry, don't step there unless you're being paid to step there and you're insured to step there and you're competent to step there. This declaration of compliance, I think, is important that we recognise that that's not a lift industry document. We may have a part to play with our capacity assessment expertise, but it is not our document, it is not our process. We'll support it and understand what we can do to help, but it's not our document. This piece about capacity assessments, picking up on Gina's piece, that those should be completed by competent persons within the lift industry, but possibly assessing demand that's defined by others, in terms of what that mix of disabilities might be. And I think from the industry side, we should clarify at the time of tendering precisely which design standards or codes of practice the equipment is to be designed and commissioned in compliance with. We've gone through a job recently in London where the fire engineers wrote firefighters lift, and we said, well, it doesn't run in a protected core. And they said, oh yeah, but it doesn't need to. So we said, well, there's not firefighters lift then, is it? And we said, well, it is, but it just doesn't have a protected core. So we said, well, what do you want us to spec? Is it a Part 72 lift? Because if it is, then I'm sure that the tester is not going to sign his declaration of conformity because it doesn't comply to some of the principles of Part 72. So I think there's some real problems there if we're not focused on the detail of what we're being asked to provide. Final slide. These guidance documents still are consultation, and they're significantly improved from the pre-consultation form, but in my opinion, and I think maybe Nick would agree, that there's still another final step and revision to do. It requires continued input from the industry. We have had some very successful recent calls with the representative team in the GLA. I think a surprisingly positive call in terms of that they had listened, they had made changes, they're welcoming the support and the engagement that we're providing, and there's an opportunity there. Yeah? And I guess the confusion that it has existed, that hopefully will disappear, in my mind is encouragement for us all as an industry to try to make sufficient time to comment on these draft documents. Now the next big one is clearly going to be Part 76, hopefully this month. I don't know how long we'll have as an industry to respond in that public comment process. Maybe Nick can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A session. But the opportunity is still there to influence the London Plan document. The guidance is open until the 20th of June. This slide deck provides links to the documents. And we're getting there, I think. Thank you.